Thank you, Robbie. Thanks to my friends and relations for turning up. It occurred to me that to receive this honor is to receive the Oscar for our profession. So in the spirit of the Oscars, I need to thank the people who got me up here. But out of the many, I mentioned just two. First is Malcolm Pines, who published my first book. And second is Liesl Hurst, who was my group analyst for being Liesl Hurst. And about this, about the work itself, this turn in my thinking partly came about because of the preoccupations of my last book. But it has also been heavily influenced by conversations with my wife Angelica Goltz and her ways of thinking. Unfortunately, despite taking good notes and despite my best efforts, she continues to disagree with me on several key points. I hope to have better luck convincing you. And finally, in this moment, I also want to remember three colleagues and friends who were important to me and who sadly are no longer here, and I miss their faces. Dennis Brown, Tom Hamrogue, and Marisa Dillon Weston. So just to say some preliminary things, I'll be using the terms ethics and morality interchangeably, as there's no agreement in moral philosophy about the distinctions between them. And the paper itself speaks to the fundamentals of our profession and is not limited to any particular school or modality. And in this paper, rather than try and take an objectivist position, the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel has called it, I will be speaking from a subjective viewpoint, from within a journey rather than from outside it. And the danger in proceeding in this way is that at the end of the journey, it might turn out that all I would have done is reinvent a number of well-known and well-worn wheels. And in some cases, this is sort of true, but I would say it is always so. We continually find things afresh for yet another first time, as Garfinkel once said, be it an insight or the first smell of spring, as though we had never known these things before. In this process, something comes alive for yet another first time. So, in speaking to you in this way, I hope to bring alive for you, for perhaps yet another first time, something that has come alive for me. And finally, given that in this talk I'll be touching on terms like soul and love, I should flag up something about my attitude to these notions. Some might presume that having moved to the alternative universe called Totnes, where crystal and angel therapy abound, that I've literally gone off with the fairies. This is not so. I will be speaking as a secularist. I will not be calling on higher powers, and what I have to say is firmly grounded in the everyday and the ordinary. So, in a book called The Philosopher's Dog, the moral philosopher Raimond Gaita I said this about their family dog, Gypsy. He said, "We did not discipline Gypsy to make her predictable. We did it to make her trustworthy." Now, when I read this sentence, it literally knocked the wind out of me, because this word pair, trust, predictability, crystallized many of the questions I'd been circling around for the last few years to do with organizational life, but also our profession of psychotherapy. And particularly as our profession starts to come to terms with the powerful arrival of CBT, the cognitive behavioral tsunami. In what follows, one of the things I want to urge is not to succumb to the panic being generated by the tsunami and rush into manualizing our ways of working, but nor do I want to advocate for a return to the arrogant complacency of the old status quo. It seems to me that here is an opportunity to really rethink what we're about. Like you, I continue to ruminate about my practice. What do I think I am doing? What am I actually doing? What do I publicly admit to about what I'm doing? Over the last few years, my ruminations have been fed by the repeated appearance of the theme of forgiveness in various guises in the clinic and my own life. It was in the midst of this that I stumbled across Gaita's work, which triggered the thought in me that the practice of psychotherapy is actually a work in ethics. But the thought of going public with this epiphany generated considerable anxiety in me, as it goes against the grain of the ruling paradigm, which is that psychotherapy is a scientific treatment and concerned with matters of fact, not value. And when matters of value enter the clinical arena, politics and morals say, then in the main, we have been trained to think of them as expressions and symptoms of internal dramas, and for them to be reductively interpreted as such. Now, my work to date could be construed as me drawing on Norbert Elias to champion the views of radical Fuchs over those of the orthodox. And this work can be summarized with the maxims that the we is prior to the I, and that the I is a conflictual entity constituted out of the varieties of we one is born into. And the fact that the we is constituted by power relations leads to the first assertion, that the psyche is constituted and patterned by the field of power relations one is born into. Now, my second assertion leans heavily on the moral philosophy of Raimond Gaita. And I begin with Fuchs's notion of belonging, which he said is critical to psychological well-being. Belonging means that we have a place in the world, but it also means that we find ourselves placed in the world. This reminds us that power relations are also intrinsic to notions of belonging and community. Anyhow, as soon as one starts talking about belonging and community, then one is immediately precipitated into the territory of morals and ethics. At the very least, this is because communities define themselves in part by the meaning worlds they sign up to. And of necessity, these are moral considerations. What is a good life? What is a bad life? What is right? What is wrong? These ways, these distinctions, these ways of life form the boundaries of community. To say that we live in a social world is also to say that we live in a moral universe. The second assertion then is this. The psyche is not only constituted by power relations, it is also constituted by moral relations. Gaita puts it like this. We cannot radically rescind from the ethical constitution of our inner lives without becoming unintelligible to ourselves. In other words, one cannot conceive of a self outside, beyond, or devoid of ethics, because ethics and morals constitute the self. Without them, there would be no self to speak of. Consequently, the lives we lived would no longer be recognizably human, as they would have been rendered meaningless. I now find myself somewhat bemused. Why does the idea that the self is ethically constituted feel so new to me, given that at the very beginnings of psychoanalysis we have Freud's vision of the superego, given that Klein's collected works are called Love, Guilt and Reparation? Surely all this speaks to the moral domain. And yet, despite these ideas and works being familiar to me, for me, this felt like a new thought. I have to say for me, because it might not be for you. I know that my importance to the world is very limited, and soon enough, for all the difference it'll make, I may as well have never existed. As someone called Martin Myers once said, first you're an unknown, then you write one book and you move up to obscurity. More significantly, in a few billion years, our entire solar system will be cosmic ash. To this perspective, our lives and preoccupation are utterly irrelevant. This realization can lead to nihilistic despair. And one way out of this despair is to ask, what is the universe for? Or what is the purpose of existence? This attempt to give meaning to our brief and haphazard lives by imagining that we are part of some larger cosmic plan, was closed off by Wittgenstein when he asked why people think that an afterlife should solve the problems of life or give meaning to life. Why should the meaning of the next life not be as problematic as the meaning of this one? And yet, despite recognizing my utter insignificance, my life nevertheless feels more or less meaningful to me. Is this hubris on my part? Am I in the grip of a grandiose delusion? I think it neither. My view is this: we are meaning-making beings in a meaningless universe. So how do we make meaning? And is the meaning we make meaningful? To ask these sorts of questions is actually to ask, where does our moral sensibility of right and wrong come from? This is because, as I hope it is already becoming evident, moral frameworks are intrinsic to meaning schemas. But how do they arise? Here are three answers. It is the case that ethical capacities are innate in all human beings. However, much like the innate capacity for language, the socialization processes come to give this innate capacity particular shapes and forms. These internalized conventions become aspects of the social unconscious. This describes something very important: how pre-existing systems of morality come to be established in individuals. But it has little to say about how and why those moral schemas should arise in the first place. So, the instinctivist streams within psychoanalysis, specifically Freud and Klein, derive the moral sensibility out of internal psychological mechanisms. And an instance of this is Freud's derivation of the sense of social justice. He begins with the older child's jealous, murderous feelings towards the younger sibling. The child partly solves the difficulty by identifying with the younger sibling. Next, Freud says, if one cannot be favorite oneself, at all events, no one else shall be favorite. He tells us that it is this dynamic that is the source of our desire for equality and justice. Quote, social justice means that we deny ourselves many things so that others may have to do without them as well. This is not a version of social justice that I find inspirational. In both the Freudian and Kleinian account, the moral attitude is a structural psychological solution. It is a way of managing internal difficulties to allow us to live with other people. This sort of account renders morality instrumental. It is a means to an end, the end being the safety and survival of the self. This sort of account of how morality comes to be established in the self does not touch me, and nor does it move me. In contrast, when Gaita says, we are ethically constituted, I find myself moved and come to hear something for the first time. Does it matter whether I am moved or not? And ought I to trust that which moves me? I will attend to these important questions shortly, but first I want to describe the account that does move me. Gaita's derivation of morality fits well in different ways with aspects of the worldviews of Winnicott and Bowlby, and I won't be able to elaborate on that here. And because his derivation of morality is relational, it is also deeply congenial to the group analytic sensibility. Gaita says that the seeds of our moral attitudes are to be found in the deep attachments we form with each other, and specifically through the attachment called love. And this is how he describes it. As infants, the persons we attach to start to matter to us. And because they matter to us, we come to feel concern for their well-being. It is this concern for them that makes us want to act in kindly and decent ways towards them, and generates in us a sense of obligation to them. It is these sorts of considerate attitudes and behaviors that we end up calling moral. And it is this that makes our lives feel meaningful. The point I want to emphasize is that meaning is constituted by the kinds and quality of relationships one finds oneself embedded in. It is the presence or absence of our attachment objects and the ethical quality of those relationships that make our lives feel more or less meaningful and fulfilling. It is both as ordinary and as profound as that. I'm now going to summarize the discussion in 3 different ways because it highlights different points. So, the first is to say that there are 2 different kinds of morality, one of which is an instrumental morality of the Freudian kind that is essentially self-serving. The other is an empathic morality that is other-serving. And whilst registering the distinctions between the 2, it is important not to create an opposition between them and to hold on to a more nuanced position. Gaita puts it like this: fidelity and justice are not reducible to the material or psychological advantages they bring, but neither are they separable from them. Another way of encapsulating the discussion is the distinction between the idea that human nature is the enemy of ethics, in which ethical frameworks are a way of controlling a savage human nature. And this is contrasted with Gaita's vision, in which ethics are an expression of human nature. Once again, the distinction is not to be taken as an opposition. Rather, I want with Gaita to emphasize the second of these, which says that there are versions of obligation, civility, kindness, and generosity that are ends in themselves, the basis of which are to be found in our responsive capacity for empathy and love. I am not for a moment wanting to deny the darker side of human life. Of course, adults, children, infants are also self-centered, devious, hateful, demanding, and difficult. But on what basis is it claimed, as it often is, that these aspects of the human condition are more real and fundamental than those of love, compassion, and generosity? The final way of characterizing the territory is to collate 3 routes through which 3 versions of morality come to be established in each of us. First is the process in which we unconsciously imbibe pre-existing moral norms of the communities we are born into. This is the social unconscious. Second is the morality of rules and regulations. Here, one learns to say please, sorry, and thank you in the right times and at the right places. And useful though this might be as a social lubricant, in itself it can remain empty etiquette. This kind of morality is in conflict with desire, embodied as it is in the conflict between the superego and the id. The third source arises out of one's responsive capacities, out of one's responsive feelings. Here, actions construed as moral are driven by one's desires and are not in conflict with them. Here, there arises in one's body a genuine impulse to say sorry and thank you, because they give expression to feelings of remorse and gratitude that arise in response to the other. So, if we put the moral emotions in the center of the picture, then some surprising things follow out of it. For one, it leads to differentiation and individuation. And it happens in several ways, and the first of these has to do with guilt. Now, the classical psychoanalytic thesis proposes that guilt is only possible after individuation, at the point one realizes that the hated and loved objects are one and the same. Gaita, following a Wittgensteinian line, reverses the sequence to say that it is the experience of remorse that shocks me into wakefulness to realize that it is me that has injured you. In this moment, I become painfully conscious of myself as well as you as distinct beings. This is how Gaita summarizes it. Our sense of the reality of others is partly conditioned by our vulnerability to them, by the unfathomable grief they may cause us. It is also conditioned by our shocked and bewildered realization of what it means to wrong them. Remorse is that realization. Perhaps the most critical of drivers in the individuation process is love. The persons we love become irreplaceable in our affections and therefore individuated. No other child can replace this child. No other friend can replace this friend. No other lover this lover. Each is truly unique to me and no other will do. Iris Murdoch puts it like this: love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. A small experience led me to realize something similar about gratitude. On a summer holiday, on a very hot and stuffy morning, we were suddenly bathed in a deliciously soft breeze. I noticed arising in myself a feeling of gratitude. But then I became aware that there was no object for this gratitude. There was nowhere to place it. In one sense, I felt gratitude to the breeze itself, but in doing so, I animated it. Even more, I humanized it. Maybe so, but what struck me through this entirely trivial experience was the realization that I needed something or someone to receive my gratitude, and without it, the experience was somehow incomplete. So in a sense, gratitude too creates a need for the other, and it too comes to render the other real. And perhaps it is also why, when there is no receptacle for gratitude or blame, we find it necessary to invent gods in whom we can place these feelings. This then is Gaita's claim, that the moral emotions come alive when people are individuated, and the converse, that it is the evocation of the moral emotions which individuates both self and other. It follows, and we know it to be true, that it is easier to act ruthlessly against those not individuated, the faceless, generic them, because here there is no direct purchase for empathic morality, and this is where rule-based morality comes into its own. I now want to turn to questions of practice, but in order to do that, I need to step back and set up a frame within which to have that discussion. To this end, I'll start with Kant. One of the key questions Kant tussled with was that of human responsibility. He could see that much of the natural world worked more or less predictably according to the rules of cause and effect. And it was important for him that human beings weren't entirely located in the natural world, because if they were, they would have to take no moral responsibility for their decisions and actions, which would be, as it were, just consequences, just effects of prior causes. The philosopher Appiah puts it like this. He says, to understand events in the natural world, one looks for causes. But to understand human behavior, we look for reasons. There's a deep resonance between Gaita's word pair, predictability, trust, and Appiah's cause-reason. A resonance that is perfectly encapsulated by another word pair, Martin Buber's I, thou, and I, it. Predictability and cause speak to the world of things, the I and the it. Meanwhile, reason and trust speak to the world of human interaction, of I and thou. It is these terms, trust and reason, more strongly than anything else, that show that humans reside in a moral universe in the realm of meaning. Having set up this frame, the purpose of which has been to sharpen the distinction between persons and things, I move on to discussing clinical practice. The attitude that our profession is still enthralled to is that of the natural scientist, with its ideals of objectivity, of reason purged of emotion, of impersonal detachment, and so forth. The scientific-sounding languages of analysis feed this point of view: projection, matrix, nodes, networks, resonance, dynamics, and so on. We call our clinical discussions scientific meetings. Indeed, this very event today has been organized by the scientific committee of our society. When it comes to the study of things, the detached impersonal attitude of the natural scientists makes good sense. But even here, as they themselves came to realize, their investigations were never entirely impersonal nor fully detached. But now, when the same impersonal attitude comes to be utilized in the clinic, then it is no longer a scientific attitude, but a scientistic one. This is Wittgenstein's term for pseudoscience. The problem with the adoption of the scientistic attitude in the clinic is that it achieves the exact opposite of its intentions. It actually distorts what it seeks to reveal. Let me explain. When one studies a human face with an impassive eye, then unlike inanimate things, the face that is being studied is affected by the impassivity and reacts to it. As is well known, if a mother were to keep her face impassive, her infant will first make efforts to enliven her, and if that fails, it becomes distressed, and if that fails, it falls into a kind of depression. Similarly, an impassive face causes adults to feel uncomfortable, no less than infants. So, when a patient gets anxious when faced with an analyst's impassivity, the easy mistake is to think that as the analyst is not doing anything, the anxiety must belong entirely to the patient. It is in this way that a conceptual error has been built into the heart of psychoclassical theory. The point, although a truism, is nevertheless worth stressing. Humans are ever responsive beings. The patient is influenced as much by what the analyst does as by what she does not do. Gaita puts it like this. If the concepts with which we identify and explore our inner life partly determine the character of that inner life, then a scientific distortion of those concepts will not only distort our understanding, it will distort the inner life itself. The nature of the distortion created by the impassivity is this: the thou is distorted into an it. If the one who comes for help is primarily thought of as a diagnostic category, then they are rendered it. Itification works well with the paradigm of therapy as scientific treatment. Most powerful is our seemingly innocuous itifying category, patient. In the mouths of some colleagues, the term is saturated with haughty condescension. This is quite a thing to say, that the impersonal, detached attitude that is so highly prized in our profession actually distorts the clinical field. This, of course, is no surprise to the intersubjectivists, who would concur with Gaita to say that clinical phenomena are being co-created by all those who are present, and not just found by a detached, observing analyst. But I'm not here arguing that we should not use categories, which is both nonsensical as well as impossible. Buber puts it poetically. This is the exalted melancholy of our fate, that every thou in the world must become an it. This is the problem I am now faced with. If the categorization process is necessarily a detaching and distancing process, and I cannot not categorize, then what is to be done? If the scientistic attitude is distortive, if thou is bound to become it, where should I turn? To begin attempting this answer, I have to start a long way off with the question that has engaged philosophers over the ages. How do I know that other people have minds like me? The positivist Descartesian answer is that first, I observe behaviors from which I infer and deduce that others might have a conscious mind. And it is only then that I decide to respond to them on this basis, as if they had minds like me. Here, hypothesis and inference is taking place in an isolated, detached mind. Wittgenstein reverses the sequence to say, first comes our spontaneous response to another, which is the condition rather than a consequence of ascribing states of consciousness to them. Gaita puts it like this. Out of such unhesitating interactions between ourselves and between us and animals, there developed not beliefs, assumptions, and conjectures about the mind, but our very concepts of thought, feeling, intention, doubt, and so on. The key term is unhesitating. For example, the philosopher David Hume raised many grave philosophical doubts about what we can know with any certainty. But he found that in day-to-day life, these doubts dissipated when they were overtaken by the pleasures of convivial conversation with friends over a game of backgammon. Something is just called out of us, and when it is, there is no hesitation, no doubt. Wittgenstein puts it like this. What gives us so much the idea that human beings can feel? Nothing gives us so much the idea, for it is not a matter of having an idea. It is not an assumption, a conjecture, or a belief, or even knowledge. If it is not any of these things, then what is it? It is that which is unhesitatingly called out of us, which Wittgenstein calls an attitude towards a soul. The word soul is not being used here referring to an entity in the religious sense. What it refers to here is the capacity for the capacity to suffer, and with the possibility of the suffering going deep. At its simplest, soul means the capacity to feel deeply, and for the feelings to be meaningful. Another way of talking about this attitude is to say that one finds oneself moved. It is the response that is called out, say pity, that reveals the sentient nature of the other. One does not feel pity for a stone, however hard it is kicked. This attitude towards a soul is akin to Buber's notion of I-thou, and both are ethically constituted. I speak here of nothing more mysterious than empathy. We are still mired in the ideological battle between the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the emotionalism of the Romantics, of head versus heart, of thought versus feeling. The cognitive and analytic schools tending to privilege thought over feeling, and the humanistic feeling over thought. According to classical psychoanalytic ideology, it is the interpretation delivered by the detached analyst that is key to change. In his later years, Fuchs himself wasn't much for making interpretations, still less transference interpretations. Quote, "The modern tendency to put transference interpretations totally and explicitly into the center of the analytic procedure is open to grave doubt. It seems to me that the transference phenomenon, thought essential for analysis, is nevertheless a victory of the neurosis over both the therapist and patient alike. Thus, I cannot agree with the monopoly conceded in certain techniques to the transference and its interpretation. In contrast to the values of detachment, I have been arguing for the values of responsivity and its connection with meaning and ethics. And critical to this interconnectivity are the emotions, because the emotions are the vehicle through which we come to register our ethical response. Our emotions move us, and the ways we are moved towards or away, opening or closing off, are in themselves expressions of our ethical response to what is moving us. I am not by any means advocating that we dispense with our rational faculties, which are also deeply responsive. Here is the thing. Both faculties, the rational and the emotional, do cognitive work. But the cognitive work of one is not fully explicable nor reducible to the other. Pascal captured this sentiment in his aphorism, "The heart has its reasons which reason does not understand." But in order not to collapse into anti-rationalism, he also ought to have said that reason has its reasons which the heart cannot always follow. I'm now going to recast the reasons why people come for psychotherapy into the language I've been developing in this paper, as having to do with responsivity and meaning. Mostly, people come to therapy because of something having gone awry in their responsive processes, their responsive capacities. This they commonly describe symptomatically as difficulties of living with other people, be it shyness, panic attacks, fear, anger issues, and so on. But they also come because of ruptures in their meaning schemas. This they commonly describe symptomatically as suffering from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and so on. I am now going to describe my case in a nutshell. If our responsivity is integral to our humanity, then it is exactly this capacity that has atrophied or been damaged in some way in the ones who come for help. Further, this damage has come about precisely because of being treated because of being treated as an it by significant others during the developmental process. It follows then that the detached attitude of an unresponsive therapist will necessarily reproduce and reinforce the self-same experience of being an it. It is for this sort of reason that I think the therapist needs to be responsive rather than removed. Wittgenstein famously said that some things cannot be said but only shown. To this I would add that some things cannot be explained but only experienced. And it is only then that they can be metabolized and become meaningful. And for this to be possible, it requires the therapist to come out of their analytic bunker, to be responsive and be responded to. In the to and fro dance of gesture and response between protagonists, each comes progressively to be attuned to the other. With hard work and some luck, on occasion, each finds and is found by the other. It is in this moment of finding and being found that meaning comes alive. Moments like these, few and far between, are at the heart of therapy. And when this happens, I think it is an experience of love. If the therapist is able to risk being present as an ethical being, which means with their values and sense of right and wrong intact, then they are bound to be present as responsive beings. And if only on this basis it can be seen that the ideal of the therapist's detached neutrality is unsustainable. Fuchs himself was well aware of this when he said, "What I mean by following the group's lead is following with discrimination. To discriminate is to make choices, and however scientific and objective they might seem, they are always ethically constituted. For example, take these two statements. Psychotherapy should be evidence-based, and the only evidence that should count is quantitative evidence. Are these scientific claims or moral injunctions? In arguing for responsivity, I am arguing against the convention which makes not responding a virtue. Many therapists have turned not responding into an art form, of finding elegant ways of not answering questions and so forth, because they think that in responding they will be acting out in some way. And of course, often enough, that is true. But it is also the case that this way of being reproduces and reinforces earlier experiences of being not responded to, of being treated as an it. It is for these sorts of reasons, over the last years, I find myself becoming increasingly transparent in the clinic. And by transparent, I don't mean speaking about my life issues, but transparent in regards to what is arising in me in response to what is taking place in the consulting room. This then results in aspects of me being much more visible. In effect, by putting myself on the line in this way, I am continually risking myself. And that seems perfectly fair to me, as I am expecting, inviting, and requiring the ones who come for help, singular or group, to also risk being present in the room in all their complexity. I have been arguing that the moments we find ourselves being moved are important and ought to be attended to because they reveal something. What is revealed, particularly through the movement called love, is the humanity of the one who is loved. And this is the important thing. It is revealed to both the one who loves and the one who is loved. This shows just how wrong is the sanctimonious injunction that you first have to learn to love yourself before anyone can love you. The reality is otherwise. It is through being loved by others, if we are lucky enough, that we come to know that we are lovable. This surely is the significance of parental love. It reveals the child's humanity to itself. If love is absent, then something never comes alive and perhaps is killed off entirely. And let us not forget the power of the child's love to transform the parent. For many an adult, this is their first real experience of being loved. Similarly, in the clinic, I think that it is the therapist's attitude of love that is critical to the therapeutic endeavour. I have been arguing all this while that we ought to give more weight to our emotional responses in the consulting room. But in doing so, I am not saying that it is the only thing we ought to give weight to. Just because something feels right does not make it so. Indeed, it is because the emotions are not entirely to be trusted that Kant privileged the reasoning processes over the emotional ones. But no certainty is to be found in the rational realm either. For one thing, despite using the reasoning process, intelligent individuals continually arrive at differing conclusions. But there is a more fundamental problem with positivist claims of objectivity, and it is this. All rational systems, even mathematics, have to build on something they cannot prove, axioms. Axioms are deemed to be self-evident truths not requiring proof. But when axioms are stripped of their scientific clothing, they turn out to be nothing other than an experience, perhaps even just a feeling, but always something subjective. Every rational edifice, to some degree, is built on subjective sands. And so, as with the emotional realm, there is always room for doubt. For example, there was a famous occasion when Bertrand Russell became utterly exasperated, annoyed by the fact that despite his best efforts and despite arguing all night, he was unable to get Wittgenstein to concede that it was certain that there was no rhinoceros in the room they were arguing in. So we need not be all that perturbed by the unreliability of our emotional lives, because uncertainty and ambiguity are intrinsic to the human condition. Having said that, the problem remains. Given that there is no certainty, how do I decide when and whether I ought to trust the response that is arising in me? Gaita answers. When we are moved, we trust what moves us and trust that we are rightly moved. We trust wisely, however, only when trust is disciplined. I was perplexed. What does it mean to discipline trust? And then I read Fred Alford, who echoed Gaita in saying this about pity. He says, pity is an intense experience of attunement, but pity needs to be educated. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide entirely. I came to think that both of them are actually speaking of the cultivation of wisdom and thoughtful reflection. Each of them is addressing the difficulty in making decisions when one is mired in subjectivity, of knowing how to proceed when one is in the thick of things. Bion famously spoke of the difficulty of thinking under fire, which I would reframe as a difficulty of responding with authenticity in the heat of the moment. One anxiety-reducing strategy utilized for decision-making in these turbulent subjective waters is to fall back on rule-making and rule-following. For example, only speak in and through the transference. Never gratify a patient's wish, but always interpret it. Rules and regulations are indeed helpful when trying to navigate the turbulent subjective waters of the clinic, but by themselves they are not nearly enough. And I'm not, of course, advocating mindless rule breaking as the antidote to mindless rule following. As a character in the comic novel by Terry Pratchett says, "Look, that's why there are rules, understand, so that you think before you break them." Returning to the clinic, if I remain convinced that what is arising in me is meaningful, even though I might not be able to articulate the entire what and why of it, then I think that I am ethically bound to give expression to it in some way. This view is in sharp contrast to the person-centered therapist and the classical analyst, both of whom think that they should do their utmost to keep themselves out of the picture. But it is also the case that I give expression to my response, not as unassailable truth, but as a gesture into an ongoing conversation. In doing this, I am both modeling and inviting the ones who come for help to do the same. What happens next is that that which is voiced is tested and transmuted in the forge called conversation. It is in this sense that I think of the activity of therapy as responsive, ethical conversation rather than as analysis. The reality is this: we cannot help be moved. We cannot help but feel. Thought is always passionate. Gaita puts it like this: a dispassionate judgment is not one which is uninformed by feeling, but one which is undistorted by feeling. Elsewhere he cautions, if we fear that our thought has been distorted because we have been sentimentally moved, then instead of trying not to be moved, we should strive to being not sentimentally moved. In responding, we are being called upon to trust something in the face of uncertainty. And in doing so, we trust something that might well turn out to be false. That in itself is not a problem if one has trusted and acted with sincerity, and if one remains open to dialogue and revision. Protocols and manualized decision-making processes are of no help in this sort of situation because they drive the process down predetermined lines rather than staying open to the present and improvising into the unknown. The trust that is required to improvise as an ethical being is disciplined trust, which we might call wisdom. At the conclusion of this paper, we are left with two anxieties that we can never escape and nor can we resolve. The Enlightenment anxiety is that feelings are not to be trusted because they are so fickle, and instead one should trust to reason. The Romantic anxiety is that the approval of others ought not to be trusted, as it is corrupting of one's true opinion. Truth is to be found inside by following one's feelings. The first is an anxiety about our subjectivity, and the second about our capacity for objectivity. What is true is that neither should be entirely trusted, because the discourses we are born into preempt to some degree not only what we are able to think, but also what we will tend to feel about certain things, as well as the sorts of people we will tend to look to for approval, generally the more powerful. But we are not entirely determined cultural sheep. We are also, to some degree, Kantian beings, capable of questioning and inquiring into the conditions of our existence and transforming them. I say to some degree Kantian beings because we are not as free as he supposed us to be. Nevertheless, these compromised capacities are all I have at my disposal, which is why some mix of ethics and the notion of discipline becomes so very important. There are many things I've not been able to attend to in this paper, shame and justice, for example, nor have I had the space to make links with others who have spoken on similar matters. I have focused on the loving emotions and made almost no mention of the hateful ones. I have left out these and other valuable elements in the service of clarity and brevity, and not because I think them unimportant. What I have done in this paper is to place ethics at the center of the human condition and at the center of our work as psychotherapists. I have said that this requires the therapist to be a responsive presence, but this responsivity needs to be a thoughtful and disciplined one. I have also followed Kant to say that because human beings are not things, it is unethical to treat them as such. To my mind, this is one of the key charges to be made not only against the cognitivists, but also certain streams within the analytic schools, that their forms of treatment are unethical precisely because they conceptualize and treat the ones who come for help as things, despite their rhetoric asserting otherwise. There is an apocryphal story of desperate soldiers lost in enemy territory. They stumble across a map which they use to find their way to safety. They then discover that the map was for another territory entirely. The moral of the story is this, that even when one gets to where one was hoping to get to, it is not always because of the reasoning process that was utilized. In my view, whatever the school, cognitive, analytic, or humanistic, the therapies that prosper do so not because of the rationales endemic to each of the schools, but because of the therapist's ability to bring to the work an attitude towards a soul. I think that at this historical moment, we can draw moral courage from Gaita's fighting words, aimed at philosophers, but also pertinent to us. He says, we should cease to look for reductive positivist justification, while at the same time refusing to concede that this is intellectual dereliction. He's urging us not to succumb to the demand that we subject our work to the impoverished version of evidence that is prized by policymakers in today's world, and to argue why this is not an intellectual cop-out and why it is not negligence on our part. This paper, then, is my attempt at swimming against the mechanistic tide prevalent in the cognitivist therapies, as well as the scientistic tide prevalent in some of the analytic therapies, and trying to do so without succumbing to the anti-rationalism promoted by sections of the humanistic traditions. I have been arguing for the privileging of a certain version of fluidity, subjectivity, responsivity, engagement, and authenticity, in which not only is our work grounded, so is our very humanity. End.